Arrogant CEO discovers childhood sweetheart working as cleaner, his dark family secret revealed. He built an empire out of nothing but ambition. And crushed anyone who reminded him of who he used to be. Until one ordinary Tuesday, a mop, a bucket, and a familiar face cracked the walls he thought were unbreakable. Before we begin, think for a moment. Have you ever run into someone from your past who reminded you of the version of yourself you tried to forget? If yes, this story might hit home. Welcome to Mr. Nuel Stories, your home for powerful, character-driven drama. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because every day, a new story unfolds. The 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower in downtown Chicago hummed with the kind of energy that only comes from power and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below, where ordinary people scurried like ants through their ordinary lives. But there was nothing ordinary about the man who ruled this glass kingdom. Cashin Rowe stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, his 6-foot frame cutting an imposing figure in his perfectly tailored Armani suit. At 38, he possessed the kind of sharp, angular features that photographers loved and competitors feared. His dark hair was styled with military precision, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. Gentlemen, Cashin's voice cut through the boardroom like a blade. Meridian Tech has rejected our acquisition offer for the third time. They seem to think their little startup is worth more than we're offering. The 12 board members around the table shifted uncomfortably. They'd seen this look before, the slight tightening around Cashin's eyes, the way his jaw set like granite. Someone was about to be destroyed, and they were grateful it wasn't them. Sir, ventured James Morrison, the company's chief financial officer, perhaps we could increase our offer by. No. The word dropped like a stone into still water. We don't negotiate with people who don't understand their place in the food chain. Cancel their server contracts. Pull our investment from their primary backer. And make sure every tech journalist in the city knows about their security vulnerabilities. Morrison's face paled. Sir, that would essentially destroy them? Yes. Cashin's smile was as cold as winter steel. That's the point, James. When someone refuses to play ball, you don't just take the ball away, you burn down the entire field. The room fell silent except for the soft scratching of pens as assistants dutifully recorded their CEO's latest act of corporate warfare. This was Cashin Rowe's empire, built on the bones of those who dared to stand in his way. But empires, as history teaches us, are often built on foundations of sand. As the meeting concluded and the board members filed out like chastened school children, Cashin remained standing at the window. His reflection ghost-like in the glass. The city sprawled beneath him, a testament to his rise from nothing to everything. Yet in the depths of his steel-gray eyes, there flickered something that all his money and power couldn't quite extinguish, a shadow of the boy he'd once been. 22 years ago, Cashin Rowe hadn't existed. Back then, he'd been Cass Riley, a scrawny kid from Willow Creek, a blue-collar neighborhood on the wrong side of Chicago where dreams went to die and hope was a luxury few could afford. His father, Patrick Riley, had been a factory worker at Midwest Manufacturing, when he wasn't too drunk to show up for his shifts. Patrick was the kind of man who measured his worth in the bottom of a bottle and took out his failures on anyone smaller than him. Which, unfortunately for young Cass, included his wife and son. You're nothing. Patrick would roar during his drunken rages, his fist connecting with whatever was within reach. You'll never be nothing, just like your old man. But Cass's mother, Elena, had been different. Despite the bruises she tried to hide with makeup and long sleeves, despite the fear that lived in her gentle brown eyes, she'd never stopped believing her son could be more than the circumstances of his birth. You're going to be somebody special, Mijo, she'd whisper as she tucked him into bed, her fingers gentle as they smoothed his dark hair. You're going to leave this place behind and build something beautiful. Elena Riley had been wrong about many things in her short life, but she'd been right about her son's potential. What she couldn't have known was the price that potential would exact, not just from Cass, but from everyone he'd leave behind. The transformation from Cass Riley to Cashin Rowe had been as deliberate as it was complete. New name, new identity, new history carefully crafted to erase any trace of Willow Creek. He'd told people his parents died in a car accident when he was 18, a lie that came easier each time he told it. The truth was messier. His father had drunk himself to death when Cass was 19, and his mother had followed 2 years later, her heart finally giving out under the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. By then, Cass was already gone, already becoming someone else. He'd earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, studying business and computer science with the single-minded focus of a man running from a burning building. He'd graduated summa cum laude, landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm, and began his methodical climb up the corporate ladder. Each promotion, each success, each zero added to his net worth was another brick in the wall between Cash and Rowe and the boy who'd once been Cass Riley. He'd convinced himself that the past was dead and buried, that he'd successfully escaped the gravity of his origins. But gravity, as any physicist will tell you, is a force that can't be outrun forever. Now, standing in his glass tower, Cashin felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever his mind wandered too close to memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. He'd built Rowe Dynamics into a billion-dollar empire, acquired a penthouse apartment that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and surrounded himself with the kind of luxury that should have made him feel invincible. Instead, he felt hollow. His personal life was as carefully curated as his professional image. He dated occasionally, always beautiful, always successful, always temporary. He had no close friends, only business associates and social connections that served his purposes. He'd learned early that emotional attachments were weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies or abandoned by those who claimed to care. Better to be alone and powerful than loved and vulnerable. The intercom on his desk buzzed, interrupting his brooding. "Mr. Rowe?" His assistant's voice was crisp and professional. "Your 3 o'clock is here." "Send them in," Cashin replied, his mask of corporate authority sliding back into place as easily as putting on a well-worn coat. But as he turned away from the window, he caught sight of his reflection one more time. For just a moment, in the play of light and shadow on the glass, he could have sworn he saw not the face of Cashin Rowe, CEO and corporate titan, but the ghost of Cass Riley, the boy who'd once believed in love, in loyalty, in the possibility that two people could face the world together and emerge victorious. That boy had been a fool, Cashin told himself. That boy had learned the hard way that love was just another word for weakness, that loyalty was a luxury he couldn't afford, and that the only person you could truly count on was yourself. But ghosts, as Cashin was about to discover, have a way of refusing to stay buried. Tuesday, October 15th, began like every other day in Cashin Rowe's meticulously ordered existence. His alarm sounded at precisely 5:30 a.m. Followed by an hour-long workout in his private gym, a breakfast of steel-cut oats and black coffee, and a review of the overnight market reports that his team had prepared. By 7:45 a.m., his driver was navigating the morning traffic toward the Millennium Tower, while Cashin sat in the back of his black Mercedes, fielding calls and firing off emails with the efficiency of a machine designed for one purpose: making money. "The Tokyo deal is stalling," his chief operating officer, Sarah Chen, informed him over the phone. "They're asking for another week to review the terms." "They've had 3 weeks," Cashin replied, his voice carrying the edge that made subordinates scramble to please him. "Tell them they have until Friday, or we walk. There are plenty of other fish in the Pacific." "Understood, sir." "Also, the cleaning company is running their day shift today. Something about a scheduling conflict with their night crew." Cashin barely registered the information. The building's maintenance was handled by his facilities manager. Such mundane details were beneath his notice. He had bigger concerns, like the board meeting at 9, the conference call with investors at 11, and the hostile takeover he was orchestrating against a competitor who'd made the mistake of underbidding him on a government contract. The Mercedes pulled up to the tower's entrance at exactly 8:15 a.m. Cashin strode through the revolving doors into the marble-clad lobby, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor with the rhythm of a man who owned the world. The lobby of Rowe Dynamics was designed to intimidate. 30-foot ceilings, walls of black marble veined with gold, and a reception desk that looked more like an altar to capitalism than a place of business. Everything about the space screamed power, success, and the kind of wealth that could crush lesser mortals without a second thought. Cashin was halfway to the elevator bank, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked instructions to his assistant about rescheduling his lunch meeting, when he noticed the cleaning cart parked near the elevators. "And make sure the contracts are on my desk by 10, he was saying, barely glancing at the figure in the blue uniform who was mopping the floor nearby. "I don't care if their lawyers need more time. Time is money, and their money is about to become my money." The cleaning staff usually worked at night, invisible and unnoticed, the way Cashin preferred it. He had no interest in the people who maintained his empire from the shadows. They were part of the machinery, as interchangeable and forgettable as the light bulbs they replaced or the trash they emptied. But as he approached the elevators, something made him pause. It was nothing dramatic, just a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, the way the woman with the mop tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so familiar, so achingly recognizable, that it hit him like a physical blow. His phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the marble floor. The woman turned at the sound, and Cashin's world tilted on its axis. 22 years collapsed into a single, devastating moment of recognition. The face that looked back at him was older, marked by lines of weariness and sorrow that hadn't been there when she was 18. Her wild curls were now tamed into a practical ponytail, and her clothes were the anonymous uniform of the working poor. But her eyes, those deep hazel eyes that had once looked at him like he hung the moon, were unmistakably, heartbreakingly familiar. "Lila?" The name escaped his lips before he could stop it, a whisper that carried the weight of 2 decades of buried guilt and regret. Lila Monroe, now Lila Santos, according to the name tag on her uniform, froze like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. The bustling lobby around them faded into background noise as the past and present collided with the force of a freight train. She was the first to recover, straightening her shoulders with a dignity that her circumstances couldn't diminish. "Hello, Cashin," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same musical quality he remembered, though it was now tempered with a weariness that made his chest ache. The sound of his name on her lips, not Cass, the way she used to say it, but Cashin, the name of the stranger he'd become, was like a knife between his ribs. "What are you?" He stopped, the question dying in his throat. What was she doing here? The answer was obvious and devastating. She was working. She was cleaning his floors, emptying his trash, invisible and forgotten like all the other people he'd trained himself not to see. "Working," she said simply, as if reading his thoughts. "Same as you, I suppose." The elevator dinged, its doors sliding open with mechanical indifference. Cashin's assistant, Margaret, appeared at his elbow like a well-trained shadow. "Mr. Rowe? The board is waiting." Cashin looked from Margaret to Lila, his mind reeling. 22 years of carefully constructed walls were crumbling around him, and he didn't know how to stop the collapse. He began, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? How could he explain the man he'd become to the girl who'd known the boy he'd been? "You should go," Lila said softly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Important people are waiting." There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. She turned back to her mop, dismissing him as gently as she might dismiss a stranger who'd accidentally bumped into her on the street. Cashin stepped into the elevator, his legs moving without conscious thought. As the doors began to close, he caught one last glimpse of Lila's profile, bent over her work with the same quiet grace she'd possessed at 18. The elevator rose toward the executive floors, carrying him away from the past and back to his carefully ordered present. But the damage was done. The walls he'd built around his heart had cracks in them now, and through those cracks, memories were flooding in like water through a broken dam. He remembered the first time he'd seen Lila Monroe. He'd been 14, she'd been 13, and she'd been sitting alone under the old oak tree in Willow Creek Park, reading a book that was too advanced for her age. Her wild curls had caught the afternoon sunlight like spun gold, and when she'd looked up and smiled at him, Cass Riley had fallen in love for the first and last time in his life. They'd been inseparable after that, two kids from broken homes who'd found in each other the family they'd never had. Lila's father had abandoned the family when she was 10, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on a waitress's salary. But where Cass's home was filled with violence and fear, Lila's was filled with love and laughter, despite the poverty. Someday, Lila had whispered to him one summer evening as they lay on their backs under the oak tree, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, "We're going to leave this place. We're going to see the world, Cass. We're going to be somebody." Together, he'd asked, his 16-year-old heart full of hope and certainty. Together, she'd promised, her hand finding his in the darkness. Always together. But promises, Cashin had learned, were just words. And words, no matter how sincerely spoken, couldn't survive the weight of reality. The elevator reached the 42nd floor, and Cashin stepped out into the familiar territory of his executive suite. His assistant was already briefing him on the morning's agenda, his phone was buzzing with urgent messages, and the machinery of his empire demanded his attention. But for the first time in 22 years, Cashin Rowe found himself unable to focus on the business of being successful. Instead, his mind was 42 floors below, where a woman named Lila Santos was mopping floors and trying to pretend that seeing him again hadn't shattered her carefully constructed composure. The board meeting was a disaster. Cashin, normally sharp and decisive, found himself distracted and unfocused. He approved budgets without reading them, signed off on acquisitions without asking questions, and generally behaved like a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. "Sir?" James Morrison ventured during a lull in the discussion. "Are you feeling all right? You seem distracted." Cashin looked around the table at the faces of his board members, men and women who respected his ruthlessness, feared his temper, and depended on his success for their own fortunes. They were looking at him with concern now, the way you might look at a machine that had started making strange noises. "I'm fine," he said curtly, but even he could hear the lie in his voice. The meeting dragged on for another hour, but Cashin absorbed none of it. His mind kept drifting back to the lobby, to the moment when Lila had looked at him with those hazel eyes and called him by the name of the stranger he'd become. When the meeting finally ended, Cashin retreated to his office and closed the door. He stood at his window, looking down at the city below, but seeing instead a different view, the view from his childhood bedroom window in Willow Creek, where he'd spent countless nights dreaming of escape. He'd escaped, all right. He'd run so far and so fast from his past that he'd forgotten who he used to be. But now, with Lila's face burned into his memory like a brand, he was beginning to remember. And remembering, he was discovering, was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. Have you ever had a moment that completely shattered your routine? A face from the past that made you question everything you'd built? Drop a comment below if you've ever experienced something similar, because sometimes, the universe has a way of forcing us to confront the people we used to be. The rest of Tuesday passed in a haze of half-completed tasks and distracted conversations. Cashin found himself staring at his computer screen without seeing the words, signing documents without reading them, and responding to questions with answers that had nothing to do with what was being asked. By 5 o'clock, his assistant Margaret was looking at him with barely concealed concern. "Mr. Rowe," she said carefully, "perhaps you should consider going home early today. You seem under the weather." Under the weather. If only it were that simple. Cashin felt like a man who'd been struck by lightning, not killed, but fundamentally altered at the cellular level. "Cancel my dinner meeting," he heard himself say. "And clear my schedule for tomorrow morning." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. In the 5 years she'd worked for him, Cashin had never cancelled a meeting, never cleared his schedule, never shown any sign of being anything other than a perfectly calibrated machine designed for maximum productivity. "Of course, sir. Should I reschedule?" "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "Just, cancel everything." He left the office without another word, taking the elevator down to the parking garage where his driver waited with the Mercedes. But instead of giving his home address, Cashin found himself saying something that surprised them both. "Take me to Willow Creek." The driver, a consummate professional named Thomas who'd been with Cashin for 3 years, didn't even blink. "Any particular address, sir?" "Willow Creek Park." "You can wait in the car." The drive took 45 minutes through Chicago's evening traffic, carrying Cashin from the gleaming towers of downtown to the faded neighborhoods of his youth. As they crossed the invisible line that separated his present from his past, Cashin felt his chest tighten with each familiar landmark. There was Murphy's Corner Store, where he and Lila had spent their allowance money on penny candy and comic books. There was the bus stop where they'd waited together every morning for the school bus, sharing dreams and secrets in the gray dawn light. There was the intersection where Lila's mother had been hit by a drunk driver when Lila was 15, an accident that had left Mrs. Monroe with a permanent limp and medical bills that would haunt the family for years. And there, at the heart of it all, was Willow Creek Park. The park hadn't changed much in 22 years. The same cracked basketball court, the same rusted-code playground equipment, the same walking path that circled the small pond where ducks paddled in lazy circles. And in the center of it all, like a monument to memory, stood the old oak tree. Cashin got out of the car and walked slowly toward the tree, his expensive shoes crunching on the fallen leaves. October in Chicago was beautiful in its melancholy, the trees dressed in shades of gold and crimson, the air crisp with the promise of winter, the light soft and forgiving in the way that only autumn light could be. He stopped at the base of the oak tree and looked up into its branches. Somewhere in that canopy of leaves, carved into the bark with a pocketknife that had belonged to Lila's grandfather, were 2 sets of initials inside a heart, CR plus LM forever. Forever. What a joke that had turned out to be. Cashin closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him like a tide he was too tired to fight. Summer, 1999. He was 17, she was 16, and they were lying on a blanket under the same tree, sharing a bag of chips and planning their future with the confidence of people who believed love could conquer anything. "I got into Northwestern," he'd told her, his voice tight with excitement and terror. "Full scholarship. Computer science and business." Lila had sat up, her face glowing with pride and joy. "Cass, that's amazing. I knew you could do it. I knew you were destined for something big." He'd corrected her, pulling her down for a kiss that tasted like salt and possibility. "We're destined for something big. You're coming with me, remember? We're going to get out of here together." But even as he'd said the words, he'd seen the shadow that crossed her face, the same shadow that had been there for months, ever since her mother's accident had left the family drowning in debt. "Cass," she'd said softly, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest, "what if I can't come right away? What if I need to stay and help my mom for a while?" "Then I'll wait," he'd said without hesitation. "I'll get established, get a job, and then I'll come back for you. We'll figure it out, Lila. We always do." She'd smiled then, but it was a sad smile, the smile of someone who was already saying goodbye. "Promise me something," she'd whispered. "Anything." "Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter how successful you become or how far you go, you'll never forget who you are. You'll never forget us." He'd kissed her again, tasting the salt of tears. He hadn't realized she was crying. "I promise, Lila. I promise I'll never forget." But he had forgotten. Or maybe forgetting was the wrong word, maybe he'd chosen to forget, chosen to bury those memories so deep that they couldn't hurt him anymore. The truth was uglier than forgetting. The truth was that he'd abandoned her. Oh, he'd told himself it was temporary. He'd gone to Northwestern with every intention of keeping his promise, of coming back for Lila once he'd gotten established. He'd called her every day for the first month, every other day for the second month, once a week for the third. But college was intoxicating for a boy from Willow Creek. The professors who saw his potential, the classmates who came from money and spoke casually of internships at Fortune 500 companies, the whole glittering world of possibility that opened up before him like a flower blooming in fast forward. And slowly, gradually, Willow Creek began to feel like a weight around his ankle, dragging him down toward a life he'd fought so hard to escape. The calls became less frequent. The visits home stopped altogether. When Lila called him, crying about her mother's latest medical crisis or her brother's arrest for dealing drugs, Cashin found himself making excuses, promising to call back later, finding reasons to be too busy for the problems of his past. The last time they'd spoken was during his sophomore year. Lila had called to tell him that her mother was dying, that the family was losing their house, that she was dropping out of community college to work full-time to support her younger siblings. "I need you, Cass," she'd whispered into the phone, her voice breaking. "I know you're busy, I know you have important things to do, but I need you. Please come home." He'd been at a fraternity party when she called, surrounded by people who represented everything he wanted to become. The music was loud, the beer was flowing, and a girl named Jessica, a senator's daughter with perfect teeth and a trust fund, had been flirting with him all evening. "I can't," he'd said into the phone, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "I have midterms, and there's this internship opportunity, and..." "You can't, or you won't?" Lila had asked quietly. The question had hung between them like a blade. In the background of the call, he could hear her mother coughing, the wet, rattling sound of lungs giving up their fight. He could hear her little brother crying, and her sister trying to comfort him. He could hear the sound of a family falling apart, and he'd chosen to turn away. "I'm sorry, Lila," he'd said finally. "I'm so sorry, but I can't come back. Not now. Maybe after graduation." She'd hung up without another word. He'd tried calling back the next day, but her number had been disconnected. He'd written letters, but they'd come back marked "Return to Sender." It was as if Lila Monroe had simply vanished from the face of the earth, taking with her the last connection to the boy he'd once been. So he'd done what he did best, he'd moved forward. He'd thrown himself into his studies, graduated summa cum laude, landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm. He'd changed his name from Cass Riley to Cashin Rowe, invented a new history for himself, and built a wall around his heart so high and so thick that nothing could penetrate it. Until today. Until a mop and a bucket and a familiar face had brought it all crashing down. Now, standing under the oak tree where they'd carved their initials and promised each other forever, Cashin felt the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just Lila, though losing her had been like losing a limb, but himself. The boy who'd believed in love, who'd thought loyalty mattered more than success, who'd dreamed of changing the world instead of conquering it. That boy was gone, buried under 22 years of ambition and ruthlessness. But seeing Lila again had awakened something in Cashin that he'd thought was dead, a conscience, maybe, or just the memory of what it felt like to be human. His phone buzzed with a text message, probably something urgent from the office. But for the first time in his adult life, Cashin ignored it. Instead, he sat down at the base of the oak tree, closed his eyes, and let himself remember what it had felt like to be Cass Riley, the boy who'd loved Lila Monroe with all his heart and promised her the world. The boy who'd broken that promise and spent the rest of his life running from the consequences. As the sun set over Willow Creek Park, painting the sky in shades of regret and possibility, Cashin made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back the choices that had led him here. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make amends. The question was, would Lila give him the chance? The next morning, Cashin arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual, his stomach knotted with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades, nervousness. He'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of his penthouse bedroom, trying to figure out what he would say to Lila when he saw her again. "I'm sorry" seemed inadequate for 22 years of abandonment. "I never forgot you" was a lie that would insult them both. "I've missed you" was true but selfish. What right did he have to miss someone he'd chosen to leave behind? He positioned himself in the lobby at 7:30 a.m., pretending to review documents on his tablet while actually watching the entrance for any sign of the cleaning crew. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird, and he found himself checking his reflection in the polished marble walls, smoothing his tie, running his fingers through his hair. When had he become so vain? When had his appearance mattered more than his character? At 8:15, she appeared. Lila entered through the service entrance, pushing a cart loaded with cleaning supplies. She wore the same blue uniform as the day before, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail. But today, Cashin was really looking at her, not just seeing the ghost of the girl he'd once known, but the woman she'd become. She was still beautiful, but it was a different kind of beauty now. Where 18-year-old Lila had been all soft curves and bright laughter, 38-year-old Lila Santos was lean and angular, her beauty sharpened by hardship into something more complex and profound. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, and her hands, he remembered those hands, how soft they'd been when they'd held his, were now calloused from years of hard work. She saw him watching her and paused, her grip tightening on the handle of her cart. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the expanse of marble and memory. Then Lila squared her shoulders and began walking toward the elevators, her movements deliberate and professional. She was going to ignore him, Cashin realized. She was going to pretend yesterday had never happened, that they were strangers sharing the same space by coincidence. He couldn't let that happen. Lila. He stepped into her path, close enough to smell the faint scent of her shampoo, something floral and inexpensive that somehow smelled better than the designer perfumes worn by the women he usually dated. She stopped, her hazel eyes meeting his with a directness that made him feel exposed. Mr. Rowe, she said formally, and the name hit him like a slap. Don't, he said quietly. Please don't call me that. It's your name, isn't it? There was no malice in her voice, just a weary acceptance that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. You know it's not. Not really. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same intensity she'd once brought to her favorite books. No, I suppose it isn't. But then again, I don't really know who you are anymore, do I? The words were spoken softly, but they cut deep. Cashin felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart, which he'd convinced himself was made of stone, but something deeper. His soul, maybe, if he still had one. I'm still me, he said, and immediately realized how ridiculous that sounded. Lila's smile was sad and knowing. Are you? Because the Cass I knew would never have walked past someone he cared about without stopping to help. The Cass I knew would never have let 22 years pass without a single word. I tried to call. Once. You tried once, and when I didn't answer, you gave up. She shook her head, not in anger but in disappointment, which was infinitely worse. But that's okay, Cashin. I understand. You had important things to do, important people to become. I was just, what did you call it in that last conversation? A weight around your ankle? He flinched as if she'd struck him. I never said that. You didn't have to. It was in your voice, in the way you couldn't wait to get off the phone and get back to your real life. She started to move around him, but he stepped sideways, blocking her path again. Please, he said, and the word came out rougher than he'd intended. Just, give me 5 minutes. Let me explain. Explain what? How you became exactly what you always said you'd never become. How you turned into the kind of person who looks right through the help. She gestured to her uniform, her cart, the invisible badge of service that marked her as beneath his notice. There's nothing to explain, Cashin. You made your choices. I made mine. What choices? The question burst out of him before he could stop it. What happened to you, Lila? What happened after After you left? She finished the sentence he couldn't. Life happened. My mother died 6 months after our last conversation. Lung cancer, probably from all those years of breathing in the fumes from the factory where she worked double shifts to keep us fed. My brother Miguel got arrested for dealing drugs. He was trying to help pay for Mom's medical bills, but the judge didn't care about that. He got 5 years. Each word was like a physical blow. Cashin felt his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis as the true cost of his abandonment became clear. My sister Rosa was only 14 when Mom died. Lila continued, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. Someone had to take care of her, make sure she finished school, keep her from ending up like Miguel. So I did what I had to do. I worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and made sure she had a chance at something better. Did she? Cashin asked quietly. Did she get her chance? For the first time since they'd started talking, Lila's expression softened. She's a nurse now. Married to a good man, 2 beautiful kids. She lives in Denver, sends me pictures of my niece and nephew every week. Pride crept into her voice, the kind of pride that came from sacrifice freely given. She doesn't know how close we came to losing everything. I made sure of that. And you? The question came out as barely a whisper. What about your chances? Lila's smile was rueful. I had my chance. I was married for 8 years to a man named David Santos. He was kind, patient, everything a woman could want in a husband. He loved me, and I cared for him. Deeply. The past tense wasn't lost on Cashin. What happened? He died. Heart attack at 34. No warning, no time to say goodbye. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. She shrugged, but Cashin could see the pain she was trying to hide. Turns out he'd been hiding some debts, trying to protect me from worrying. When he died, I lost the house, the car, everything. Started over again at 35 with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination to survive. Cashin felt sick. While he'd been building his empire, accumulating wealth and power beyond his wildest teenage dreams, Lila had been fighting just to keep her head above water. While he'd been networking at charity galas and closing million-dollar deals, she'd been working multiple jobs and grieving the loss of everyone she'd ever loved. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. Lila, I'm so sorry. If I had known. You would have what? Sent a card? Made a donation to charity in my mother's name? She shook her head. You made your choice, Cashin. You chose your future over your past, your success over your promises. I don't blame you for that, we all do what we have to do to survive. But don't stand here now and pretend you would have done anything differently. The elevator dinged, and the door slid open. Lila pushed her cart inside, then turned to face him one last time. I have work to do, she said simply. And so do you. Let's just leave the past where it belongs. The doors began to close, but Cashin stepped forward, his hand shooting out to stop them. I can't, he said desperately. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I can't pretend I don't. Don't what? Lila's voice was sharp now, cutting through his fumbling words like a blade. Don't care? Don't remember? Don't feel guilty? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Save it, Cashin. I learned a long time ago that pretty words don't pay the bills or bring back the dead. You want to ease your conscience? Write a check to charity. You want to feel better about yourself? Volunteer at a soup kitchen. But don't drag me into your midlife crisis just because seeing me reminded you that you used to have a heart. The doors closed with mechanical finality, leaving Cashin standing alone in the lobby with the taste of regret bitter in his mouth. Sometimes the people we leave behind make the greatest sacrifices. If you've ever had to choose between your dreams and your family, you'll understand Lila's choice. Hit the like button if this resonates with you, because the hardest decisions are often the ones that define who we really are. For the next 3 days, Cashin found himself haunting the lobby of his own building like a ghost seeking redemption. He arrived early, stayed late, and invented excuses to be on the ground floor whenever the cleaning crew was working. But Lila had become a master at avoiding him, timing her work to coincide with his meetings, taking service elevators when she saw him coming, and generally treating him with the polite invisibility reserved for unwanted attention. It was driving him insane. Cash and Rowe was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. When he wanted a company, he bought it. When he wanted a contract, he negotiated until he got it. When he wanted information, he hired the best investigators money could buy. But he couldn't buy Lila's forgiveness, couldn't negotiate his way back into her good graces, and couldn't investigate his way into her heart. Or could he? The thought came to him on Friday afternoon as he sat in his office, staring at a quarterly report without seeing the numbers. He'd built his empire on information, knowing his competitors' weaknesses, understanding market trends before they became obvious, anticipating problems before they became crises. Why should his personal life be any different? He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. Marcus Webb Investigations, came the crisp voice on the other end. Marcus, it's Cash and Rowe. I need you to look into someone for me. Marcus Webb was the best private investigator in Chicago, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage and background checks. He was discreet, thorough, and expensive, exactly the kind of man Cashin preferred to do business with. Of course, Mr. Rowe. What can you tell me about the subject? Cashin hesitated. What he was about to do felt like a violation, but he needed to understand what had happened to Lila in the years since he'd abandoned her. He needed to know how she'd ended up cleaning floors in his building, needed to understand the full scope of the damage his choices had caused. Her name is Lila Santos, formerly Lila Monroe. She's 38, works for Pristine Cleaning Services. I need to know everything: her employment history, financial situation, family circumstances. Everything. How far back do you want me to go? 22 years, Cashin said. Quietly. I want to know everything that's happened to her since 2001. If Marcus found the request unusual, he didn't show it. I'll have a preliminary report for you by Monday morning. Make it Sunday night. And Marcus? This is confidential. More confidential than usual. Understood, sir. Cashin hung up the phone and immediately felt like a bastard. But he needed to know. He needed to understand the woman Lila had become, the life she'd built from the ashes of the dreams they'd once shared. The weekend passed with agonizing slowness. Cashin tried to distract himself with work, with his usual routine of gym sessions and business dinners, but his mind kept drifting back to Lila. He found himself remembering things he'd thought he'd forgotten, the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes, the way she'd curl up against him when they watched movies at her house, the way she'd believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Sunday evening, Marcus's report arrived via encrypted email. Cashin poured himself 3 fingers of his most expensive scotch and settled into his leather chair to read about the life he'd missed. The report was thorough and devastating. After Cashin had left for college, Lila had enrolled in community college, studying to become a teacher. She'd maintained a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at a local diner to help support her family. But when her mother's cancer diagnosis came in 2002, Lila had dropped out to become her primary caregiver. The medical bills had been crushing. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments and medications had cost tens of thousands of dollars. Lila had worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waitressing during the day, and doing bookkeeping for local businesses on weekends. She'd sold everything of value the family owned, including her grandmother's wedding ring and her father's vintage guitar. When her mother died in 2003, Lila had been left with $47,000 in medical debt and 2 younger siblings to raise. Miguel, her brother, had been 17 and already running with a bad crowd. Rosa had been 14 and struggling in school. Lila had become their legal guardian, working even harder to keep the family together. Miguel's arrest in 2004 had been the breaking point. He'd been caught selling drugs to pay for his mother's remaining medical bills, and despite Lila's pleas to the judge, he'd been sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The legal fees had added another $15,000 to Lila's debt. But somehow, she'd persevered. She'd kept Rosa in school, helped her with homework every night despite her own exhaustion, and made sure her sister had the opportunities she'd never had. Rosa had graduated high school with honors and earned a nursing scholarship to a state university. In 2007, Lila had met David Santos, a mechanic who'd been kind enough to fix her car for free when she couldn't afford the repairs. They'd dated for 2 years before marrying in a small ceremony at the local courthouse. David had been a good man, steady, reliable, and deeply in love with his wife. He'd helped Lila pay off her remaining debts and had even started a small college fund for Rosa. For 8 years, Lila had been happy. Not the wild, passionate happiness of her youth, but the quiet contentment of a woman who'd found peace after years of struggle. She and David had talked about having children, had even started looking at houses in better neighborhoods. Then, in 2015, David had collapsed at work. Massive heart attack, dead before the paramedics arrived. The autopsy revealed a genetic condition no one had known about, a ticking time bomb that had finally exploded. The financial devastation had been swift and complete. David's life insurance policy had lapsed due to a missed payment, and his business had been carrying significant debt that Lila had known nothing about. Within 6 months, she'd lost the house, the car, and most of their possessions. At 35, she'd been forced to start over with nothing. The report detailed her employment history since then, a succession of low-paying jobs that barely covered rent on a studio apartment in one of Chicago's rougher neighborhoods. She'd worked as a hotel housekeeper, a restaurant dishwasher, a retail clerk, and finally, a commercial cleaner. She'd never remarried, had no children, and according to her financial records, lived paycheck to paycheck with no savings to speak of. But the most heartbreaking detail was buried in the middle of the report. Every year on Cashin's birthday, Lila had made a small donation to Northwestern University's scholarship fund. $5, $10, whatever she could spare from her meager income. The memo line on each donation read the same thing, in memory of dreams deferred. Cashin set down the report with shaking hands and reached for his scotch. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire of guilt and regret burning in his chest. While he'd been accumulating wealth beyond measure, Lila had been donating her lunch money to his alma mater. While he'd been networking with Chicago's elite, she'd been working 3 jobs to keep her family together. While he'd been building his empire, she'd been sacrificing everything, her education, her dreams, her youth, for the people she loved. And through it all, she'd never once tried to contact him. Never asked for help, never sought him out, never tried to guilt him into remembering his promises. She'd simply endured, with a dignity and strength that put his own accomplishments to shame. Cashin's phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, he glanced at it, expecting another urgent business matter that would demand his immediate attention. Instead, he saw a news alert that made his blood run cold. His hands trembling, Cashin clicked on the link and began to read. The article was the first in a planned series about corporate executives whose success had come at the expense of others. And the first executive they'd chosen to profile was Cashin Rowe. But it wasn't his business practices they were investigating. It was his past. The reporter, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, had somehow uncovered the truth about his origins. She'd found records of Cass Riley, traced his transformation into Cashin Rowe, and discovered the family he'd left behind in Willow Creek. More importantly, she'd discovered what his father had done. The article detailed Patrick Riley's embezzlement from Midwest manufacturing, the dozens of families who'd lost their pensions and savings, the suicides and divorces and destroyed lives that had followed in the wake of his crimes. It named names, told stories, and painted a picture of a community devastated by one man's greed and cowardice. And at the center of it all was the question that would destroy everything Cashin had built: did his son know? Had Cashin Rowe built his empire on the foundation of his father's stolen money? The answer, of course, was no. Cashin had never known the full extent of his father's crimes, had never benefited from the stolen funds. But the truth, as he was about to learn, was often less important than the perception of truth. His phone began ringing. First his assistant, then his lawyer, then board members and investors and reporters, all wanting answers to questions he didn't know how to answer. But the call that mattered most never came. Somewhere in the city, Lila Santos was probably reading the same article, learning the same devastating truth about the family that had destroyed hers. And Cashin knew, with the certainty of a man watching his world collapse, that she would never forgive him for this. Not because he was guilty of his father's crimes, but because he was guilty of something far worse. He'd abandoned her to face the consequences alone. The empire he'd built was about to crumble, and for the first time in his adult life, Cashin Rowe didn't care about the money he was about to lose. He only cared about the woman he'd lost long ago, and the forgiveness that was now forever beyond his reach. Monday morning arrived like a funeral march. Cashin's phone had been ringing non-stop since the Tribune article went live at midnight, but he'd turned it off after the 15th call from reporters wanting a statement. His email inbox was flooded with messages from board members, investors, and business partners, all demanding explanations he didn't have. But none of that mattered as much as the woman he knew would be waiting for him in the lobby. Cashin arrived at the office at 6 a.m., 2 hours before his usual time, hoping to avoid the media circus that was undoubtedly gathering outside. His driver had taken a circuitous route through back alleys and service entrances, but even so, Cashin could see the news vans parked across the street, their satellite dishes pointed at his building like weapons. The lobby was eerily quiet, lit only by the emergency lighting that stayed on overnight. But Cashin wasn't alone. In the center of the marble expanse, next to her cleaning cart, stood Lila Santos. She wasn't working. She was just standing there, waiting, her hands clasped in front of her like a woman preparing to deliver a eulogy. She'd obviously read the article, her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying, and when she looked at him, Cashin saw something in her expression that was worse than anger or hatred. He saw pity. "Hello, Cashin," she said quietly as he approached. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath, the barely controlled emotion that threatened to break through her composure. "Lila, Did you know?" The question cut through his attempted greeting like a blade. "When you left for college, when you stopped calling, when you built your empire, did you know what your father had done?" Cashin stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough to see the pain in her eyes but far enough to give her space to breathe. "No," he said simply. "I swear to you, Lila, I had no idea." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because her shoulders sagged slightly, as if she'd been holding her breath. "I believe you," she said finally. "The Cass I knew wouldn't have been able to live with that kind of secret. He was too honest, too good." The past tense hit him like a physical blow. "I'm still that person, Lila." Underneath all of this, he gestured to his expensive suit, his marble lobby, the empire that was crumbling around him. "I'm still the boy you knew." Lila's smile was infinitely sad. "No, you're not. That boy would have come home when I needed him. That boy would have kept his promises. That boy would have cared more about the people he loved than the success he could achieve." "I did care." "Did you?" Her voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composure. "Because when I called you, crying, begging you to come home because my mother was dying, you were at a party. I could hear the music in the background, the laughter, the sound of people having fun while my world was falling apart. And you chose them over me." Cashin felt the words like physical blows. "I was young, I was scared. We were both young. We were both scared." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, 22 years of suppressed pain finally breaking free. "But I didn't have the luxury of running away. I didn't get to reinvent myself and pretend my past didn't exist. I had to stay and face the consequences of what your family did to mine." "What do you mean?" But even as he asked the question, Cashin was beginning to understand. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. "My father," Lila said, her voice breaking. "My father worked at Midwest Manufacturing for 15 years. He had a pension, savings, a plan for retirement. When your father stole that money, when the company went bankrupt, my dad lost everything. His pension. His health insurance, his hope for the future. Cashin felt the blood drain from his face. Lila, I didn't know. He started drinking after that. My strong, proud father who'd never touched a drop of alcohol in his life started drinking to numb the pain of watching his family struggle. And when the drinking didn't help anymore, when the shame became too much to bear, he walked out on us. Just left one morning and never came back. The lobby seemed to spin around Cashin as the full weight of his family's legacy crashed down on him. Your father left because of what my father did. My mother worked herself to death trying to make up for what we lost. The double shifts, the stress, the constant worry about money, it all contributed to the cancer that killed her. And Miguel. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks on her cheeks. Miguel was so angry about what happened to our family, so desperate to help, that he made stupid choices that landed him in prison. Jesus, Lila, I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead, Cashin. Sorry doesn't undo 22 years of struggle. Sorry doesn't give me back the life I should have had, the dreams I had to abandon, the family that was destroyed by your family's greed. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of history pressing down on them like a physical force. Around them, the marble lobby that had once seemed like a monument to success now felt like a mausoleum, a tomb for all the lives that had been sacrificed to build it. What can I do? Cashin asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. How can I make this right? Lila looked at him with eyes that held no hope, no forgiveness, no possibility of redemption. You can't, she said simply. Some things can't be fixed, Cashin. Some damage is too deep, too permanent. You can't bring back my parents, can't give Miguel back the years he lost in prison, can't undo the choices that led us both to this moment. But I have money now, resources. I could help you, help your family. With what? Blood money? Her laugh was bitter and broken. Do you think I want anything that came from the empire you built while my family was suffering? Do you think money can buy forgiveness for 22 years of abandonment? Cashin felt something breaking inside his chest, something fundamental and irreparable. Then what? What do you want from me? Nothing, Lila said, and the word fell between them like a stone into still water. I want nothing from you, Cashin Rowe. I wanted something from Cass Riley once upon a time. I wanted him to keep his promises, to remember where he came from, to care more about love than success. But that boy is dead, isn't he? You killed him when you decided that your past was something to be ashamed of instead of something to be honored. She turned to go, pushing her cart toward the service elevator, but Cashin couldn't let her leave. Not like this. Not with so much left unsaid. Lila, wait. Please. She stopped but didn't turn around. What, Cashin? What else is there to say? I loved you, he said desperately. I loved you more than anything in the world, and I never stopped. Not really. Every success, every achievement, every dollar I made, it was all meaningless because you weren't there to share it with me. Now she did turn, and the look on her face was one of infinite sadness. Love isn't just a feeling, Cashin. Love is a choice. It's choosing to stay when things get hard, choosing to sacrifice when sacrifice is needed, choosing to honor your commitments even when it costs you everything. You may have felt something for me once, but you didn't love me. If you had, you never could have walked away. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Lila stepped inside. As the doors began to close, she looked at him one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said quietly. But you won't find it in the past. That's gone forever, and no amount of money or power can bring it back. The doors closed, leaving Cashin alone in the lobby with the echoes of her words and the weight of his choices. Around him, his empire was crumbling. He could hear his phone buzzing with urgent calls, could see the reporters gathering outside, could feel the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in. But for the first time in 22 years, Cashin Rowe didn't care about his empire. He only cared about the woman who'd just walked out of his life forever, taking with her the last piece of his humanity. Can you forgive someone for their family's sins, even when they didn't know? This is the question that will determine both their futures. What would you do in Lila's position? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of legal meetings, emergency board sessions, and damage control that felt increasingly futile. The Tribune's exposé had opened the floodgates, and every major news outlet in the country was now digging into Cashin's past, his father's crimes, and the connection between the two. The stock price of Roe Dynamics had plummeted 40% in 3 days. Major clients were canceling contracts, citing reputational concerns. The board was in full panic mode, with several members calling for Cashin's immediate resignation. But the worst part wasn't the financial devastation or the professional humiliation. The worst part was the silence from the one person whose opinion mattered most. Cashin had tried calling Pristine Cleaning Services, only to be told that Lila Santos was no longer employed there. He'd driven to her last known address, a studio apartment in a rundown building on the south side, but the landlord said she'd moved out without leaving a forwarding address. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, just like she had 22 years ago. On Thursday evening, as Cashin sat in his office reviewing resignation letters and severance packages, his assistant Margaret knocked on the door. "Mr. Rowe? There's someone here to see you. She says it's personal." Cashin's heart leaped. "Send her in." But it wasn't Lila who walked through his office door. It was a young woman in her early 30s with familiar hazel eyes and wild curls that had been tamed into a professional style. She wore scrubs and a hospital ID badge, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same musical quality that had haunted Cashin's dreams for 2 decades. "Mr. Rowe? I'm Rosa Santos. Lila's sister." Cashin stood slowly, his mind reeling. This was the 14-year-old girl Lila had sacrificed everything to raise, now grown into a confident, successful woman. "Rosa. It's good to meet you." "Is it?" Rosa's tone was polite but cool. "I'm not sure my sister would agree." "Where is she?" The question burst out of him before he could stop it. "I've been trying to find her, to talk to her." "She's gone." Rosa settled into the chair across from his desk without being invited, her posture straight and professional. "Left Chicago yesterday morning. She asked me not to tell you where she went." Cashin felt something die inside his chest. "But you're here anyway." "I'm here because I need to understand something." Rosa leaned forward, her eyes so much like Lila's, but harder, more direct, fixed on his face. "I need to understand how the boy my sister loved enough to wait for could become the man who destroyed her life." "I never meant." "Meant what? To abandon her when she needed you most? To build your fortune while she worked 3 jobs to keep our family together? To let 22 years pass without a single word?" Rosa's voice was rising, her professional composure cracking. "Or did you mean to have your father steal the money that was supposed to secure our future?" "I didn't know about my father's crimes," Cashin said quietly. "I swear to you, Rosa, I had no idea." "Maybe not. But you knew about Lila. You knew she was struggling, knew she needed you, and you chose your ambition over your promises." Rosa pulled a worn envelope from her purse and placed it on his desk. "She wanted me to give you this. She said it was time you knew the whole truth." With trembling hands, Cashin opened the envelope and pulled out a letter written in Lila's familiar handwriting. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded, and as he began to read, he realized it was dated December 15, 2003, just 2 weeks after their last phone conversation. "Dear Cass**. I'm writing this letter knowing I'll probably never send it, but I need to put these words somewhere before they eat me alive from the inside*. Mom died yesterday. The cancer finally won, and she went peacefully in her sleep with Rosa and me holding her hands. Her last words were about you. She asked me to tell you that she was proud of the man you were becoming, that she knew you'd do great things with your life asterisk. I didn't have the heart to tell her that you'd already forgotten us asterisk. I know you think I'm angry with you for not coming home, for choosing your new life over your old promises. But I'm not angry, Cass. I'm heartbroken, but I'm not angry. I understand why you had to leave, why you can't come back. This place is quicksand, and you were smart enough to escape before it pulled you under asterisk. What you don't understand is that some of us never had the choice to leave. Some of us had to stay and face the consequences of other people's actions, had to pick up the pieces and try to build something from the wreckage asterisk. I need you to know something, though. Something I should have told you years ago but was too proud, too scared, too young to say asterisk. I love you. Not loved, love. Present tense, ongoing, probably forever. I love the boy who used to read to me under the oak tree, who held me when I cried about my father leaving, who promised me we'd see the world together someday. I love the man you're becoming, even if that man doesn't have room in his life for the girl he left behind asterisk. And because I love you, I'm letting you go asterisk. I'm not going to call anymore, not going to write letters you won't answer, not going to hold on to dreams that died the day you realized you were too good for this place. You deserve to be happy, Cass. You deserve success and love and all the beautiful things this world has to offer. You deserve a future that isn't weighed down by the past asterisk. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me that when you're standing on top of the world, when you have everything you ever dreamed of, you'll remember where you came from. Remember the people who loved you before you were successful, who believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself asterisk. Remember that love isn't about what someone can do for you, it's about what you're willing to do for them asterisk. I hope someday you'll find someone who loves you the way I do, completely and without conditions. And when you do, I hope you'll choose to stay asterisk. All my love, always asterisk. Lila asterisk. P.S. I'm pregnant asterisk. The letter slipped from Cashin's nerveless fingers and fluttered to the floor. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the words sank in, as the full magnitude of what he'd lost became clear. Pregnant, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Rosa nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She miscarried 3 months later. The stress, the grief, the exhaustion, her body just couldn't handle it all. She never told anyone except me, never put your name on any medical forms, never tried to contact you about it. Cashin felt like he was drowning, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I had a child. We had a child. You had a chance at a child, Rosa corrected him. But you'd already made your choice by then. You'd already decided that your past wasn't worth preserving. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 22 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. Cashin stared at the letter on the floor, at the words that revealed the true cost of his ambition. She never remarried after David died, Rosa said quietly. Never even dated. I used to ask her why, and she'd always say the same thing, I already had my great love. Some people are lucky enough to get one. I'm not greedy enough to ask for two. Where is she? Cashin asked again, his voice breaking. Please, Rosa. I need to see her, need to tell her. Tell her what? That you're sorry? That you wish things had been different? That you love her? Rosa stood, her expression a mixture of pity and disgust. She knows all of that, Cashin. She's always known. But knowing and forgiving are two different things. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. You want to know the really tragic part? Even after everything, after you abandoned her, after your father destroyed our family, after she lost the baby and her husband and every dream she ever had, she still loves you. She still keeps that picture of you two under the oak tree in her wallet. She still donates to your alma mater every year on your birthday. Rosa's smile was sad and knowing. But love isn't enough, is it? Love without loyalty, without sacrifice, without the willingness to choose someone else's happiness over your own success, that's not love at all. That's just selfishness dressed up in pretty words. She opened the door, then turned back one final time. "She asked me to tell you something. She said to tell you that she forgives you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying that anger was poisoning her soul. She forgives you, and she hopes you find peace. But she won't see me." "No," Rosa said simply. "She won't. Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean giving someone another chance to hurt you. It just means letting go of the pain so you can move forward." After Rosa left, Cashin sat alone in his office as the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of regret and loss. The letter lay on the floor where it had fallen, its words burned into his memory like a brand. He'd lost everything: his company, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. But those losses paled in comparison to what he'd really lost: the woman who'd loved him unconditionally, the child they might have had together, the life they could have built if he'd been brave enough to choose love over ambition. For the first time in 22 years, Cashin Rowe allowed himself to cry, for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become, and for the woman who'd loved them both enough to let them go. 6 months later, Cashin stood in the parking lot of Midwest Manufacturing, staring at the abandoned factory where his father had once worked, and where his crimes had destroyed so many lives. The building was a skeleton now, its windows broken, its walls covered in graffiti, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. But it wouldn't stay that way much longer. "Mr. Rowe?" The voice belonged to Maria Gonzalez, the project manager he'd hired to oversee the renovation. "The contractors are ready for your final approval on the plans." Cashin nodded, pulling his attention away from the ghosts of the past and focusing on the future he was trying to build. "Let's take a look." The plans spread across the hood of Cashin's car showed a transformation that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Where once stood the abandoned shell of Midwest Manufacturing, there would soon rise the Willow Creek Community Center, a place of healing, education, and hope for the neighborhood that had been devastated by his father's crimes. "The main floor will house the Job Training Center," Maria explained, pointing to the blueprints. "Computer skills, trade certifications, small business development. The second floor will be dedicated to educational programs, GED classes, college prep, financial literacy." Cashin nodded, his eyes tracing the careful lines that represented his attempt at redemption. "And the memorial?" "Here, in the main lobby." Maria indicated a space near the entrance. A wall with the names of all the families affected by the original scandal, and a plaque explaining the center's mission to honor their sacrifice. It wasn't enough. Cashin knew it would never be enough to truly balance the scales of justice. But it was a start, a concrete way to channel his guilt into something that might actually help the community his family had destroyed. The past 6 months had been the most difficult of Cashin's life, but also the most meaningful. After Rosa's visit, he'd made a series of decisions that had shocked everyone who knew him. First, he'd resigned as CEO of Rowe Dynamics, selling his shares and using the proceeds to establish the Riley Family Victims Fund, a trust designed to provide financial assistance to the families affected by his father's embezzlement. The fund would pay for medical bills, educational expenses, and small business loans, administered by a board of community leaders who had no connection to Cashin himself. Second, he'd liquidated his personal assets, the penthouse, the art collection, the luxury cars, keeping only enough to live modestly while he figured out what came next. The rest went into the fund, along with a commitment to donate any future earnings above a middle-class salary. Third, and most importantly, he'd returned to Willow Creek. The neighborhood hadn't welcomed him with open arms. Many residents remembered Patrick Riley's crimes, and they weren't inclined to trust his son, regardless of his apparent change of heart. There had been angry confrontations, suspicious glares, and more than one suggestion that he take his guilt money and leave. But Cashin had stayed. He'd rented a small apartment 3 blocks from his childhood home and had begun the slow, painful work of earning forgiveness. Not through grand gestures or charitable donations, but through showing up, day after day, to do whatever needed to be done. He'd volunteered at the local food bank, sorting donations, and serving meals to families struggling to make ends meet. He'd tutored kids at the community center, helping them with homework and college applications. He'd joined neighborhood cleanup efforts, picking up trash and painting over graffiti with the same hands that had once signed million-dollar deals. Most importantly, he'd listened. He'd sat in community meetings and heard story after story of how his father's crimes had rippled through the neighborhood like stones thrown into still water. He'd learned about the Morales family, who'd lost their home when Mr. Morales's pension disappeared. He'd met Mrs. Chen, whose husband had committed suicide rather than face the shame of losing his life savings. He'd heard about the Johnsons, whose daughter had to drop out of college when the family could no longer afford tuition. Each story was a weight added to his conscience, but also a reminder of why this work mattered. These weren't abstract victims or statistics in a newspaper article, they were real people whose lives had been shattered by his family's greed. Mr. Rowe? Maria's voice brought him back to the present. The community board is here for the final walkthrough. Cashin looked up to see a group of 5 people approaching, local residents who'd been elected to oversee the community center project. They'd been skeptical of his motives from the beginning, and he couldn't blame them. Why should they trust the son of the man who'd destroyed their neighborhood? Mrs. Patterson, he said, greeting the group's leader with a respectful nod. Eleanor Patterson was a retired teacher in her 70s who'd lived in Willow Creek her entire life. She'd lost her husband's pension in Patrick Riley's scheme, but she'd also become one of the most vocal advocates for giving Cashin a chance to make amends. Cashin, she replied, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Show us what you've got. For the next hour, they walked through the construction site, discussing everything from the placement of security cameras to the color of the paint in the children's reading room. The board members asked tough questions, challenged his assumptions, and made it clear that this was their community center, not his personal monument to guilt. And that was exactly how Cashin wanted it. The job training programs look good, said Marcus Williams, a local mechanic whose father had worked alongside Patrick Riley. But what happens when the money runs out? What happens when you get bored of playing savior and move on to the next project? It was a fair question, one that Cashin had been asked many times over the past 6 months. The endowment is structured to be self-sustaining, he replied. The initial investment will generate enough income to cover operating expenses in perpetuity. And I'm not going anywhere, Marcus. This is my home now. Is it? The question came from Carmen Rodriguez, a young mother who worked 2 jobs to support her family. Because 6 months ago, you were living in a penthouse downtown, making more money in a day than most of us see in a year. What makes you think you belong here now? Cashin met her gaze steadily. I don't know if I belong here, he said honestly. That's not for me to decide. But I know I need to be here. I need to do this work, not because it makes me feel better about myself, but because it's the right thing to do. And if we told you to leave? Carmen pressed. If we said we don't want your money or your guilt projects? Then I'd leave, Cashin said simply. But I'd still find a way to help, even if it meant doing it from a distance. This isn't about my redemption, Carmen. It's about justice. It's about trying to repair some of the damage my family caused. The group exchanged glances, having a silent conversation that Cashin wasn't privy to. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke. We've been talking, she said. About you, about this project, about whether we can trust you to see it through. Cashin's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. And? We've decided to give you a chance. Not because we think you deserve it, but because this community needs what you're offering. Her eyes were sharp and assessing. But understand this, we'll be watching. Every dollar spent, every decision made, every promise kept or broken. You mess this up, and you're done. Not just with this project, but with this community. I understand, Cashin said, and he meant it. Thank you for trusting me with this opportunity. As the group dispersed, Mrs. Patterson lingered behind. Walk with me, she said, and Cashin fell into step beside her as they headed toward the old oak tree in the center of the park. You know, she said conversationally, I taught your father in 3rd grade. Patrick Riley was a sweet boy. Quiet, eager to please, always trying to make everyone happy. I often wondered what happened to that child, what turned him into the man who could steal from his neighbors and friends. Cashin didn't know how to respond to that, so he remained silent. I also taught Lila Monroe, Mrs. Patterson continued. Brightest student I ever had. Could have been anything she wanted, doctor, lawyer, teacher, writer. Had the whole world at her feet. I know, Cashin said quietly. Do you? Do you really understand what that girl sacrificed for her family? What she gave up to keep them together after your father's crimes tore them apart? They'd reached the oak tree now, and Mrs. Patterson stopped, placing her weathered hand on the bark. She used to come here, you know. After you left for college. She'd sit right here and read, just like she did when you two were children. Even after everything that happened, even after her mother died and her brother went to prison, she'd come here and remember better times. Cashin's throat felt tight. I didn't know. She stopped coming after she got married. David Santos was a good man, not the love of her life, maybe, but a good man who treated her well. She deserved that happiness, brief as it was. Mrs. Patterson, Cashin said carefully, do you know where she is now? The older woman studied his face for a long moment. Why? So you can ease your conscience by apologizing? So you can try to win her back now that you've decided to play the reformed sinner? No, Cashin said, and he was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. I want to know that she's okay. That she's found some peace. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. She's okay, Cashin. She's found work that matters to her, a place where she can make a difference. She's not rich, probably never will be, but she's content. That's more than most people can say. Good, Cashin said, and meant it. That's good. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set through the branches of the old oak tree. Somewhere in that canopy, Cashin knew, were the initials he and Lila had carved so many years ago, a monument to promises broken and dreams deferred. You can't undo the past, Mrs. Patterson said finally. Can't bring back the dead or heal all the wounds your family caused. But you can choose what kind of man you want to be going forward. You can choose to honor the people who were hurt by doing everything in your power to make sure it never happens again. That's what I'm trying to do, Cashin said. I know. And for what it's worth, I think you're succeeding. The boy I taught all those years ago, Cass Riley, he would have been proud of the man you're becoming. As they walked back toward the construction site, Cashin felt something he hadn't experienced in 22 years, a sense of belonging. Not the hollow satisfaction of professional success or the temporary pleasure of material wealth, but the deep, abiding contentment that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. It wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the future he'd dreamed of under the same oak tree all those years ago. But it was a good life, a meaningful life, a life that honored the memory of the people he'd lost and the promises he'd broken. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. 1 year later, the Willow Creek Community Center was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The job training programs had a waiting list, the educational classes were packed, and the small business incubator had already helped launch 6 local enterprises. More importantly, the center had become what Cashin had hoped it would be, not a monument to his guilt, but a genuine hub of community life and renewal. Cashin had found his rhythm in this new life. He worked as the center's facilities coordinator, a deliberately modest title that reflected his role as someone who kept things running smoothly rather than someone who made grand pronouncements from on high. He arrived early each morning to unlock the doors, stayed late to lock up, and spent his days doing whatever needed to be done, fixing broken equipment, mediating disputes between program participants, or simply listening to people who needed someone to hear their stories. It was honest work, meaningful work, and for the first time in his adult life, Cashin went to bed each night feeling like he'd earned his rest. The community had slowly warmed to him, though he knew he'd never be fully accepted by everyone. There were still people who crossed the street when they saw him coming, still whispers about whether his transformation was genuine or just an elaborate performance, But there were also people like Mrs. Patterson, who'd become something like a surrogate grandmother, and Marcus Williams, who'd grudgingly admitted that Cashin knew his way around a toolbox. Most importantly, there were the young people, teenagers who didn't remember Patrick Riley's crimes, who saw Cashin simply as the guy who helped them with their college applications and never judged them for their mistakes. They called him Mr. C, and their easy acceptance meant more to him than any business award he'd ever received. On this particular Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years after his encounter with Lila in the lobby of his former empire, Cashin was in the center's computer lab, helping a group of adults learn basic digital literacy skills. The students ranged in age from 25 to 65, all of them trying to improve their job prospects in an increasingly digital world. Remember, Cashin was saying to Mrs. Valdez, a 50-year-old woman who'd been laid off from her factory job, the mouse is just a tool. Don't be afraid of it. Click once to select, double-click to open. Mrs. Valdez nodded nervously, her hand trembling slightly as she maneuvered the cursor across the screen. Like this? Perfect. You're getting it. The satisfaction Cashin felt watching Mrs. Valdez successfully open her first email account was different from anything he'd experienced in his corporate life. It was smaller, quieter, but somehow more profound than closing a $1 million deal. Mr. C? The voice belonged to Jasmine, the center's teenage receptionist who worked part-time after school. There's someone here to see you. She says it's personal. Cashin's heart skipped a beat, the way it did every time someone came looking for him. For 2 years, he'd harbored a secret hope that someday Lila would walk through those doors, that she'd see what he was trying to build and maybe, just maybe, find it in her heart to forgive him. But when he walked to the front desk, it wasn't Lila waiting for him. It was Rosa. She looked different than she had in his office 2 years ago, more relaxed, less guarded. She wore jeans and a sweater instead of scrubs, and her smile was genuine rather than polite. Rosa, Cashin said, surprised. What are you doing here? I was in town visiting friends, she said. Thought I'd stop by and see what all the fuss was about. She looked around the bustling lobby, taking in the bulletin boards covered with job postings and class schedules, the comfortable seating areas where people gathered to chat, the children's corner where a volunteer was reading stories to a group of preschoolers. It's not what I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? Rosa shrugged. Something more ostentatious, I guess. A big plaque with your name on it, maybe a statue of yourself in the lobby. The kind of thing rich guys usually do when they want to buy their way into heaven. Cashin smiled ruefully. There's a plaque, but it's dedicated to the victims of my father's crimes. My name's not on it. I saw it, Rosa said. I also saw your name on the maintenance schedule. Cashin Riley, facilities coordinator. You went back to your original name. It seemed appropriate. Cashin Rowe was a character I played for 22 years. Cass Riley is who I actually am. They walked through the center together, Rosa asking questions about the programs and services, Cashin explaining how everything worked. He introduced her to staff members and volunteers, showed her the classrooms and workshop spaces, and told her about the success stories, people who'd found jobs, started businesses, or gone back to school because of opportunities they'd found at the center. You know, Rosa said as they finished the tour, Lila always said you had a good heart underneath all that ambition. I never believed her, until now. Cashin's chest tightened at the mention of Lila's name. How is she? She's good. Really good, actually. Rosa's smile was warm and genuine. She's working at a community health clinic in Portland, helping low-income families navigate the healthcare system. It's exactly the kind of work she was meant to do, helping people, making a real difference in their lives. Portland, Cashin repeated. It was far enough away to feel like another world, close enough that he could drive there in a day if he had any reason to make the trip. She's happy, Cass. For the first time since I've known her, she's genuinely happy. She has work that fulfills her, friends who care about her, a little apartment with a garden where she grows vegetables and flowers. I'm glad, Cashin said, and he meant it. She deserves happiness. She does. And so do you. Rosa studied his face carefully. You look different than you did 2 years ago. Lighter, somehow. Like you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders anymore. I'm not carrying my father's sins anymore, Cashin said. I can't undo what he did, but I can choose not to let his mistakes define the rest of my life. They'd reached the memorial wall in the lobby, where the names of Patrick Riley's victims were etched in black granite. Rosa ran her fingers over the letters, finding her parents' names among the dozens listed there. She knows about this, Rosa said quietly. About the center, about what you're doing here. I send her pictures sometimes, updates on how the programs are going. What does she think? She thinks you're finally becoming the man she always believed you could be. Rosa turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She's proud of you, Cass. She wanted me to tell you that. The words hit Cashin like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. After everything he'd done, everything he'd failed to do, Lila was proud of him. It was more than he'd dared to hope for, more than he deserved. There's something else, Rosa said, reaching into her purse. She wanted me to give you this. She handed him a small envelope, his name written on the front in Lila's familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, Cashin opened it and pulled out a single photograph. It was the picture from under the oak tree, the one he'd thought was lost forever. He and Lila at 16 and 15, their arms around each other, their faces bright with love and hope and the absolute certainty that they could conquer the world together. On the back, in Lila's handwriting, was a simple message, for the boy who kept his promise after all. L. Cashin stared at the photograph, his vision blurring with tears he didn't try to hide. She kept this all these years? She kept a lot of things, Rosa said gently. The good memories, the love, the belief that people can change and grow and become better than they were. She let go of the anger and the hurt, but she never let go of the hope. I don't understand. What promise did I keep? Rosa smiled, the same radiant smile that had once lit up Lila's face. You promised her you'd never forget who you were, never forget where you came from. It took you 22 years, but you kept that promise. You came home, Cass. You finally came home. True redemption isn't about grand gestures, it's about showing up every day to do the work. If this story has moved you, please subscribe to Mr. Nuel Stories for more powerful tales of transformation, because sometimes the longest journey is the one that leads us back to ourselves. 5 years had passed since Cashin Rowe had died and Cass Riley had been reborn. The Willow Creek Community Center had become a model for similar programs across the country, and Cass had been invited to speak at conferences and workshops about community-based redemption and restorative justice. But he rarely accepted those invitations. His work was here, in this neighborhood, with these people who'd given him a second chance he'd never thought he deserved. On this autumn evening, as the sun set through the branches of the old oak tree, Cass sat on a bench in Willow Creek Park, reading letters from the center's scholarship recipients. The Riley Family Victims Fund had evolved over the years, expanding beyond simple financial assistance to include educational scholarships for young people from the neighborhood. This year's recipients included Maria Santos, no relation to Lila, who was studying to become a social worker, James Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's grandson, who was pursuing a degree in sustainable engineering, and Angela Chen, whose grandmother had been one of Patrick Riley's victims, and who was now in her second year of medical school. Each letter was a reminder that redemption wasn't a destination but a journey, one that required daily choices to put others' needs before your own, to build up rather than tear down, to heal rather than harm. Mr. C? Cass looked up to see Jasmine approaching, now a college sophomore who still worked part-time at the center during her breaks. She was carrying a manila envelope and wearing the kind of expression that suggested important news. What's up, Jazz? This came for you today. Special delivery. She handed him the envelope, which bore the return address of a law firm in Portland, Oregon. Cass's heart began to race as he opened the envelope and pulled out a legal document. It was a will, Lila's will, along with a letter from her attorney. Dear Mr. Riley, I regret to inform you that Ms. Lila Santos passed away peacefully on October 10 after a brief battle with cancer. In accordance with her wishes, I am forwarding you a copy of her will, as you are named as a beneficiary. Ms. Santos spoke of you often in her final weeks, and asked me to tell you that she was grateful for the man you became and proud of the work you've done to honor the memory of those your family hurt. Please accept my condolences for your loss. Sincerely, Margaret Foster, Attorney at Law. The letter slipped from Cass's nerveless fingers as the reality hit him like a physical blow. Lila was gone. The woman who'd loved him first and best, who'd forgiven him when he couldn't forgive himself, who'd believed in his capacity for redemption even when he'd lost faith in his own humanity, she was gone. With shaking hands, he picked up the will and began to read. Most of Lila's modest estate was left to Rosa and her children, but there was a specific bequest that made Cass's breath catch in his throat. To Cass Riley, formerly known as Cashin Rowe, I leave my collection of books and the oak tree photograph, with the hope that he will continue to find wisdom in stories and strength in memories. I also leave him this final letter, to be opened only after my death. Jasmine had quietly retreated, giving him privacy to grieve. With trembling fingers, Cass opened the sealed envelope that contained Lila's final words to him. My dearest Cass. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I hope you're not too sad. I've had a good life, not the life we planned when we were young and foolish enough to think love could conquer everything, but a good life nonetheless. I want you to know that I've been following your work at the community center, watching from afar as you transformed from the man who broke my heart into the man who's been healing others. Rosa sends me pictures and updates, and every time I see what you've built, what you've become, my heart swells with pride. You kept your promise, Cass. Not the promise to come back for me, that was a young man's promise, made before we understood how complicated life could be. You kept the deeper promise, the one that mattered more. You remembered who you were, where you came from, and what it means to love someone more than you love yourself. I need you to understand something. I never blamed you for leaving. You were 18 years old, brilliant and ambitious, with the whole world opening up before you. Of course you left, it would have been tragic if you hadn't. What broke my heart wasn't that you left, but that you forgot to take me with you in your heart. But you remembered eventually, didn't you? You came home to yourself, came back to the values we learned together under that old oak tree. You chose love over success, community over profit, healing over revenge. You became the man I always knew you could be. I want you to know that I forgave you long ago, not because you earned it through your good works, but because holding on to anger was poisoning my ability to love others. Forgiveness isn't something you do for the person who hurt you, it's something you do for yourself, to free your heart for better things. And I want you to know that I loved you until the very end. Not the desperate, possessive love of our youth, but the deep, abiding love that comes from truly knowing someone's heart. I loved the boy who dreamed of changing the world, and I loved the man who actually did it, one small act of kindness at a time. Don't mourn for me, Cass. I had love, yours, David's, my family's, the love of the people I was able to help in my work. I had purpose, meaning, the satisfaction of knowing I made a difference in the world. I had enough. But you still have work to do. You still have people to help, lives to touch, wounds to heal. The community center is just the beginning. There are other neighborhoods like Willow Creek, other families struggling with the aftermath of other people's crimes, other young people who need someone to believe in their potential. Promise me you'll keep going. Promise me you'll keep choosing love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation. Promise me you'll remember that true success isn't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the lives we touch and the love we leave behind. And promise me you'll be happy. Find someone to love who loves you back. Build a family, whether through blood or choice. Plant gardens, read books, watch sunsets, laugh until your sides hurt. Live fully, love deeply, and don't waste another moment regretting the past. The boy I fell in love with under the oak tree grew up to be exactly the man I hoped he would be. I couldn't be prouder of you, or more grateful that our lives intersected, even briefly, in this beautiful, complicated world, asterisk. All my love, always and forever, asterisk. Lila asterisk. P.S. Check the last page of our old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. I left something there for you, asterisk. Cass sat in the gathering darkness, tears streaming down his face as he absorbed Lila's final gift, not just her forgiveness, but her blessing on the life he'd built from the ashes of his mistakes. She'd seen him clearly, loved him completely, and believed in his capacity for redemption even when he'd lost faith in himself. The next morning, he drove to Portland to attend her funeral. It was a small service, attended by Rosa and her family, colleagues from the health clinic where Lila had worked, and a handful of patients whose lives she'd touched. Cass sat in the back, listening as person after person spoke about Lila's kindness, her dedication, her ability to see the best in everyone she met. When it was over, Rosa approached him with a small box. "She wanted you to have these," she said simply. Inside the box were Lila's books, worn paperbacks and hardcovers that showed the evidence of being read and reread, loved and treasured. At the bottom of the box was their old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the one they'd read together under the oak tree when they were teenagers. Cass opened to the last page and found what Lila had left for him, a pressed flower from the oak tree, still fragrant after all these years, and a note in her teenage handwriting. "For Cass, who taught me that real courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through. Love always, L." Standing in the Portland cemetery, surrounded by strangers who'd loved the woman he'd lost twice in one lifetime, Cass made a promise. He would keep going. He would keep building, keep healing, keep choosing love over fear. He would honor Lila's memory not through grief, but through joy, by living the kind of life she'd always believed he was capable of living. And someday, when his own time came, he would meet her again under that eternal oak tree, where promises were kept and love endured forever. 10 years have passed since Cass Riley returned to Willow Creek, and the transformation has been remarkable, not just of the neighborhood, but of the man himself. The community center now serves as a model for similar programs in dozens of cities across the country. The scholarship fund has sent over 200 young people to college. The job training programs have helped thousands of adults build better lives for themselves and their families. But perhaps the most important transformation has been in Cass himself. The hollow, driven man who once measured his worth in dollars and deals has become someone who understands that true wealth lies in the connections we make, the lives we touch, and the love we give and receive. He never remarried, never had children of his own, but he became a father figure to countless young people in the neighborhood. He never accumulated great wealth again, but he lived richly, surrounded by a community that had learned to trust him, to value him, and eventually, to love him. On quiet evenings, you could often find him sitting under the old oak tree in Willow Creek Park, reading one of Lila's books or simply watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope and possibility. Sometimes children would join him there, asking him to tell them stories or help them with their homework. Sometimes adults would seek his counsel, knowing he was someone who understood both success and failure, both pride and humility. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind stirred the leaves above his head, Cass could almost hear Lila's laughter echoing through the branches, reminding him that love, real, honest, selfless love, never truly dies. The lesson of Cass Riley's story isn't that we can undo our mistakes or erase the pain we've caused others. Some wounds are too deep, some losses too permanent, some consequences too far-reaching to be completely healed. But we can choose how we respond to our failures. We can choose to run from our past or to face it with courage and humility. We can choose to let our guilt consume us or to transform it into a force for good. We can choose to live for ourselves or to live for something greater than ourselves. Cass chose redemption over despair, service over selfishness, love over fear. He chose to honor the memory of those he'd hurt by dedicating his life to helping others. He chose to become the man Lila had always believed he could be, even when he'd lost faith in himself. And in making those choices, day after day, year after year, he discovered something that all his corporate success had never taught him, that the most meaningful life is not the one that accumulates the most wealth or achieves the most recognition, but the one that gives the most love and leaves the world a little better than it found it. So the next time you encounter someone from your past, someone who reminds you of who you used to be, who you might have been, or who you still could become, remember Cass and Lila's story. Remember that it's never too late to choose love over ambition, connection over isolation, redemption over regret. Remember that the person you used to be doesn't have to define the person you become. And remember that sometimes, the greatest success comes not from building an empire, but from rebuilding a life, your own and others, on a foundation of truth, humility, and love. This has been Mr. Nuel Stories, where every tale reminds us that we all have the power to write a better ending to our story. If this journey moved you, if it made you think about your own choices and relationships, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and feed the soul. Because every day is a chance to begin again, every moment is an opportunity to choose love, and every story, including yours, has the potential for redemption. Until next time, remember, the person you used to be holds the key to the person you're meant to become.